Hello everybody and welcome to another Fun Friday. Haven't done one of these in a while, but it's time to revisit the good old Dystopian Wars courtesy of Warcradle, who have sent out the box sets that you're going to be seeing in this video. So there were two box sets that showed up, and I've been painting as much as I can in between various field and research trips, hence the slight delay to this video. But, you know, they say good things come to those who wait, and this week we're going to be looking at some Americans. Some German reinforcements have shown up as well, but of course the American battle fleet is a new faction for the game. Well, it's publicised in advance as being one of the existing ones, but this is the first time we've got to see the models for it. So this is the artwork for the Constitution battle fleet. Let's see what you get in the box. So this is obviously after having been undercoated, but near enough the same colour. So you get two of these sprues. You can see there's parts for a couple of frigates or destroyers there, and one cruiser, and then up there on the left, some weird kind of little drone spotting aircraft, which is quite interesting. And of course, two identical sprues means that you have two cruisers, two spotting drones, and four little frigate or destroyer analogues, depending on what you want to use them for, how you're going to build them. You also get this. This is the battleship. Now, unfortunately, in this particular instance, I have actually got the superstructure there the wrong way around. It does actually go the other way around on the ship, but, you know, well, it's still on its little form, so it's not too much of an error. But you can see this is a relatively simple bit of battleship kit. You literally just trim that bit off, pop the superstructure on top of the hull, and then it's just a case of adding weaponry once you've painted it all. So that's quite good. In contrast, however, the frigate destroyer analogues are pretty much one of the more complex ones to put together. Bear in mind, so far we've put together ships from Antarctica, ships from Prussia or Germany, ships from Russia, and ships from China and Japan. And yeah, these ones, they weren't the most challenging ships I've ever put together for Dystopian Wars, but they were some of the most fiddly. So you can see they have multiple sections here. The hull is a three-part piece, so you've got two sides and a back, so usually I've put that together. Then the superstructure and guns are in two halves, and they go together. As you can see on top, I've also popped the funnels on top there, just for this purpose. So this is where what I would personally recommend to be the configuration you paint them in, although you don't have to listen to me. I mean, some people paint entirely on sprue, which I do for some ships. Some people wait until the entire thing is painted, which can lead to access issues being something of a problem. This is the stage that I usually would start painting something of this type on. But you can see now the deck is made up of two separate sections. So the bow there goes on pretty nicely, but then this other section is sort of a little bit of a platform deck, if you like. And this, you have to slot the guns and the forward part of the superstructure in through the hole in the middle first, and then lever it upwards. And then that causes the rest of the superstructure to settle down. It's got these locking lugs you can see in the middle. That is a little bit fiddly, and although it does result in a fairly close fit, this is why I recommend painting the deck now rather than once you put it all together. You can see here how the superstructure and gun section goes together with the upper deck, and then how it goes together with the lower deck with the guns there just slotting in. You might have to do a little bit of trimming on that tab, and that results in this squat little character, who actually looks quite nice. And then I took it all apart again for painting. Now, for those of you who might be thinking, hang on a minute, why are these ships going around with sock and great paddle wheels? Well, this is in keeping with the aesthetic of the original Spartan Games version of Dystopian Wars, and while you might be thinking, hang on a minute, surely big paddle wheel ships are not really realistic for, you know, the equivalent of a steampunk late 19th century naval combat scenario. Well, if you've seen the video that I did on American riverine warfare in the American Civil War with Sean Chick, you will notice that a number of those vessels in fact do fairly closely resemble these kinds of ships. So it's not actually entirely unrealistic, especially when you add in the steampunk flavouring. Now, of course, it's a late 19th century American fleet. Of course I'm going to paint it as the Great White Fleet. It's one of the single greatest colour schemes ever devised by man. So, on went the paint, as you can see here. Now, in the spirit of obviously letting everyone know what I've done, as normal, I'll let you know what the paint recipe for this is. So this was, again, as with many of the ships I've been painting recently, using Games Workshop Citadel contrast paints. So over a grey sear undercoat, I use Skeleton Horde for the decking, Basilicum Grey for the guns, the funnels, and the gun barrels of the casement guns. And then I used Nazdreg Yellow for the base of the gun and the superstructure. I also used a bronze paint pen for the paddle wheel there, and then a little touch of Iandan Yellow, slightly brighter yellow, on the bow stem, just to give it a little bit of variety. The white areas were done just using White Scar layer paint on top of the base, and then a little bit of Apothecary white contrast paint just to give it a little bit of shading. And now the cruisers. As is common with a number of Dystopian Wars factions that Warcradle have released so far, although the Germans are somewhat of an exception because they have a different modularity system, the modular way that these cruisers are put together consists of a common central hull, which you can see there, and then you have a short bow section and a short stern section, exemplified here, and then also a longer bow section and a slightly larger and more complex stern section, which you can see here. And this is common across the Chinese, Japanese, and obviously the American and the Russian squadrons. The Antarcticans have a slight variation on this, and of course, say the Germans use a rail system for their modularity, so they just use a common hull. But those are the combinations. So of course, you can have long bow, complex stern, long bow, short bow, complex stern, and short bow, short stern. And these variations are called the Reliant class monitor, which, as you can see, has nothing on the back and just a single gun emplacement up front. The Yorktown class cruiser, which has two heavy gun emplacements up front, but still nothing on the stern because it's using a short stern. As you can see there, you can use rocket batteries or gun turrets, which also come on the sprues. The Intrepid class light cruiser, which has but a single heavy gun emplacement at the front, but introduces this more complex small gun on the stern. And then finally the Lexington class heavy cruiser, which has the two heavy gun emplacements forward and the lengthened stern with the smaller gun battery fitted there. Now, with some of these modular ships, like the Russians, it is possible to actually build them in such a way that you can pop the stern and bow off and reconfigure them constantly at will, as long as you've got relatively decent paint with probably a decent matte varnish to keep it from chipping from constant handling. But the slightly more complex and layered approach to building these particular ships makes me think you're probably going to have to stick to one configuration once you've built them. Now, I mean, you've got 4 cruisers, you can build one of each, or you can build 2 and 2, or whatever combination you like, but whilst the modularity for building them at the start is obviously excellent, same as all the others, I don't think you're going to get away with switching and switching and switching and switching the way you can with 1 or 2 others, especially the Germans, as we'll see a bit later. And so, here's my Lexington heavy cruiser. I actually really like this colour scheme. I added a little splash of red there because the main guns are these revolving guns. Revolver guns, effectively a gigantic revolver pistol, except on artillery scale, so you've got a single barrel, and as you can see where the red is, you have a revolving chamber holding multiple shells for rapid fire. And as you can see, I stuck with exactly the same colour palette. I just used the Iandan yellow a little bit more on some of the bow sections, the bow strakes, and also on the little decorative eagles that are down the side. I then also did the battleship. Now, it's a lot more obvious in person. It might not be so obvious in this photo, but you might be able to pick up that the yellow on the superstructure looks slightly different, slightly brighter on the battleship than it does on the cruiser. Now, there's a reason for this. Basically, as you probably know, getting a decent white paint is quite difficult, and unfortunately the white scar that I had lying around, it was a pot that's quite a few years old, and was an absolute pain to paint, and the Corax white base that I had was even worse, and actually it's slightly yellowed. You'll see a bit later when I was doing a bit of touching up on the Escort that there is actually some yellowing because of that paint. So in my infinite wisdom, I thought, okay, well, I'll go and re-undercoat the battleship because it's got such a large expanse of hull in white, and then I'll put the contrast paints over that. Except, of course, the contrast paints do allow a degree of the base layer to come through, which means if you use white, which is a bit brighter than the Gracia base that I was using for everything else, and which was originally on the battleship, well, everything comes out just that little bit brighter. So you can see there's the generator station, which I did over in some blue. The gun turrets, you can probably see best. The gun turrets are a slightly darker shade because they were still from the plastic sprue, so they got painted with Nasdrake yellow over Gracia, whereas the superstructure that they're sitting on is Nasdrake yellow over white. Now, personally, I'm not actually entirely one way or the other on which looks better. I mean, I like the colour scheme generally, and to my eye, the slightly subdued effect that you get from the yellow over the Gracia looks somewhat better. But Mrs. Drac is of the opinion that the brighter yellow actually works better. It looks more of a gold rather than a buff colour. So, well, let me know in the comments below what you think. Either way, I'm quite happy with the way this turned out, but just as a word of warning, if you are going to use contrast paints and you want a consistent finish across your fleet, make sure you use a consistent undercoat. And here's one of the little spotting drones, again, done up in the same colour scheme, because why not? It is one of the elements of the fleet, and as you can see, it comes with this little base, and this relatively easy to stick down flight stand that sticks into it. This has a ball and socket joint, so you can position it to a relative degree at whatever angle you like. I think it looks quite cute. So here's one of each ship on a display stand. Obviously there's 3 more of the little destroyer frigates and 1 more cruiser to do, although I haven't decided what format cruiser I'm going to do for the second one. And there is a second drone as well. And here's a shot of them all on a nice black surface, albeit a shiny one. I have a matte black matte coming in to reduce those kind of reflections, but once more, I really like the Great White Fleet colour scheme, and I think it's worked really well on these ships. And of course, we must contrast them with the old school Spartan stuff, because there may be a fair few of you out there, like myself, who have a bunch of old school Spartan models lying around. I obviously do. Now, I have a bunch of American stuff, but I decided after seeing the results of this colour scheme that actually I'm going to redo them entirely in that. So my old ships have been resprayed white, but as you can see here, this is a heavy battleship from the old Spartan range contrasted with the new Warcradle battleship. So they're about the same length, but the Warcradle one is a lot more heavily built up. The old American line from Spartan were relatively low down to the water. And since this is a Lexington heavy cruiser, I picked up a battle cruiser. So these are all from the version 2.0 Spartan box set, the Naval Flotilla one. And as you can see again, size-wise is approximately the same. Aesthetic-wise is approximately the same. You can see in the version 2.0 Spartan stuff, there was this trend towards slightly more built-up ships, which the Warcradle set has taken and accelerated a little bit. And then one of the escorts, the Warcradle one being noticeably larger. You can see a bit of the yellowing I mentioned there earlier. So generally speaking, the Warcradle escorts tend to be on roughly the same scale as the Spartan destroyers rather than the frigates that were the more common escorts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're a little bit easier to handle. And here they all are, all on the display stand. So in terms of will these new ships match up with your pre-existing collection, if indeed you have some, I'd say, yeah, pretty much. They're not as close a match as the Russians. The Russian ones are near enough indistinguishable, at least from sort of tabletop viewing distance. I'd say they're probably on a level roughly with the Antarctican ones. They do definitely look the part. They look like they're from the same fleet, from the same shipyards, just from maybe slightly different time periods. So effectively, the Warcradle stuff is kind of a version 2.0 or version 3.0 of the original fleets. So I think they'll mesh relatively well together. And that brings us on to the Germans. Now, I only got a basic sprue from the first release of the Germans, so I didn't get a chance to show you the German battleship. Although I probably will order the box set with the battleship in it just for completeness sake, if nothing else, at some point. However, I did get sent a complete box set for the Tempelhof battle group, which is the second of the box sets to be released for the German faction. And as you can guess from the art that goes with it, this is a battle group that is dedicated much more towards air cover and aircraft carrier capacity. Although, as you can see in the background there, it also does have an option for a stocking great Tesla cannon, which is always fun. So, out of the box, you have your resin Tempelhof carrier. So you can see, again, I have undercoated these things. And this is a relatively simple build. Again, so you've got the hull, which is one piece. You've got the superstructure island there. And then you've got this little... basically, it's the lift for the bringing aircraft up onto the deck. But as you'll see later on, this is actually two-sided, so you can have it with either a fighter or a bomber, depending on the aesthetic you want to present. There's also mounting points on the superstructure, one on the superstructure, and 3, as you can see here, for little flak turrets and sensors. And running along the side, you can see there are some secondary gun turrets just recessed under the flight deck, and they have taken inspiration from early 1920s and 30s Japanese aircraft carriers, and I suppose also HMS Furious, in having all the exhaust ducted out of the side. You also get a pair of identical sprues. In this case, they look like this. So you can see here there's parts for a cruiser, 2 escorts. These are slightly larger destroyer-scale escorts instead of frigates. And then you can also see on the right a pair of little token bases, one of 3 fighters and one of a slightly larger bomber. And these are fully deployed, whereas on the carrier, whilst the single fighter that's being brought up on the lift is fully deployed, the bomber actually has its wings folded, which again, you'll see a little bit later. And if you flip the sprue over, or indeed look at the second sprue, you'll notice that once again, we are looking at the railway system of modularity for the German cruisers here. So these have a slightly different way of giving you different configurations. Instead of changing the hull, you have the same basic hull, but the bridge structure and all of the weapons are effectively mounted on little railways, and they can drive in and out. Even the escorts have that as well, as you can see there from the escort hulls near the front. Now, the escorts are actually relatively simple to build, as were the previous ones. Now, as I say, these are slightly larger escorts. The previous escorts that came with the initial Blücher battle group, the one with the battleship in it, they just have a single gun up front. These are longer hulls, so these are slightly larger ones. And as you can see, it's simply the hull. The secondary battery and funnel sections go on either side, and then the bridge structure goes on top. And there are 2 variants, one with a more conventional gun and one with a big Tesla gun. And you get 1 gun up front on the rail tracks and 1 mounted on the bridge. So it is possible, with either a little touch of blue tack, or if you trust gravity enough, to have these as completely modular escorts. You just build the basic superstructure and you can drop the guns on and off at will. That's a little bit too small for me to suggest magnetizing, but say just a tiny touch of blue tack in the recessed notches and you're probably all good to go. Now, when it comes to painting these, I would recommend painting pretty much on sprue, because you've only got 4 sections to the main hull. The guns are obviously separate, but if you want any kind of level of detail on the inside, obviously the bridge forms a flying bridge over the rail track, and so if you build it all together, you're going to have an absolute pig of a time getting to the underside of the bridge, the aft end of the ship, or indeed the inside of the funnel and secondary batteries. Whereas with the cruisers, because there is only one cruiser hull, and it's completely interchangeable with the cruiser hull from the other box as well, I checked, there is only one way to put together the cruiser hull. So you've got your bow, you've got your stern, side plates, you've got the rail track section in the middle that makes up the bulk of the structural strength to keep it all together, 2 sets of secondary batteries, and 2 sets of funnels. Now, once again, I would advise that if you're going to paint this, you paint it in sections. You don't have to do it on sprue or in individual parts like the escorts, but I would advise putting together the hull itself, so the 2 sides, back, front, and the deck plate, painting that as a single assembly, putting the funnels together, because you see they come in 2 halves, paint the funnels separately as their own thing, and paint the secondary batteries as their own thing before attaching them. That's just me, because of the way of the colour palette that I've chosen, but I think that's the best way to avoid colour overrun and to make sure, again, that you get all the detail in all the possible facings. Now, when it comes to building the variants that come with this box set, you have the Reiter class cruiser, which you can see here uses the standard bridge tower. This is a bridge tower assembly that comes with this particular set, so it's got the little slot on top. And you can also see this tray, part 21. That little tray, or technically it's a double track flatbed truck, this is a thing that you will want to keep separate, clean, spare, and unstuck if you want to be using a modular system to swap around the types of cruiser you're using, because this is used in all 3 variants with 3 different things on it. So if you stick down, in this case, at the flat guns, well, you obviously get one with each cruiser, but you will then be stuck with that particular option. So personally, I'd keep that tray free and just rely on either gravity or a bit of blue tack again to hold those things on. But here's the Reiter class cruiser. As you can guess, it is pretty much the flak cruiser. 4 flat guns there, 3 on the tray and 1 on the bridge. And obviously the bridge moves around as well. Then this is actually quite handy, because although it looks a little bit front heavy, because it's plastic and because it is on the underside actually notched properly to fit the rails, you can drop it on and position it to a certain degree wherever you like, and it'll just stay there. I'm actually quite impressed with that. It doesn't fall over easily, if at all, and it's pretty stable and well thought out. You then have the Volsung cruiser, which swaps out the flat gun on top of the bridge for a little sensor array, and it pops down this socking great Tesla cannon on the double track tray, which I really like. Now with this is definitely where you're not going to be wanting to trust gravity. You will need a little bit of blue tack to hold that down, if just a tiny spot, if you do want to keep everything free and modular, because obviously it's just mounted onto the tray at the back, which means it will fall forward a little bit if you just use gravity. I mean, it doesn't actually look too bad canted slightly forward anyway, very difficult to notice, but you know, if you are a little bit pedantic about those kind of things, then you will want to have some form of adhesion. And then you have the most complicated of the 3 variants, the Conrad class. Now, I will admit, for my version, I actually did stick the flight deck to one of the superstructure bits, so one of the bridge elements, because otherwise it's going to be very complicated to try and work out. But that means, you know, the other one is free to be configured either in Volsung configuration, Reiter configuration, or as another Conrad if I fancy it being a bit more complex. But here you have the flight deck. It has a couple of supports, one at the back, one in the middle, which connects onto the bridge superstructure, and then of course it lays on the bridge superstructure as well to give you kind of a ski jump. And then the tray in this case, as you can see, has a couple of little fighters on it which sit on there. It's very important to make sure you get them the right way around, because the little nodules that sit into the tray are positioned differently on each of the 2 fighters so that they are correctly spaced. So this is basically all those cruisers. It's effectively a light carrier, just has some secondary guns and a entertaining method of takeoff, considering it is basically a full-length ski jump. I'm presuming that these things then return to base to the carrier, because I can tell you this much, I wouldn't want to be landing uphill. So I used the same colour scheme as I did with the previous German ships, so that is Dark Angels green for the main hull, Basilicum grey for the superstructure, Skeleton Horde for the deck, and then the black, I think it's Black Templar black, which forms the hull edging. Plus then a touch of white for the little German crosses there, and a dark silver paint pen for the gun barrels. So you can see here each of the variants of the escort. Oh yeah, I also used a sort of a green metallic paint pen for the Tesla coils there on the forwardmost escort. So here's one of the cruiser hulls in the little aircraft carrier configuration with all the attendant little spare parts you need to switch over to one of the other configurations next to it. Obviously, I've stuck the little runway down onto one of the superstructures, so I do have a separate superstructure standing over there. And here's one of the literally double rail gun versions of the cruiser from the cruiser sprue from the last box set, and you can see, so I've kept the color scheme, and you can see, yes, the cruiser hulls are in fact identical. In response to a few of you pointing out that using the contrast paints on these kind of large flat areas the first time around, paint job wasn't the best. I took that on board. I tried to be a bit more consistent and smooth with larger brush strokes and less pooling, as you can see between the two. It wasn't 100% successful, but I think a lot better than before. So here's the cruiser in its little aircraft carrier configuration. You can see the little planes on their little tray tucked in under there. And then we lift off that section, so you can see this is the whole thing just taken off there, along with the two little fighters taken off of the tray. And then just like that, it's a Volsung class. And you can see I've moved the tray to the front, stuck the little Tesla cannon on there. I did put a little bit of red glaze around some of the power coils to give a slight variant just from the green. And then the bridge, the independent bridge superstructure there's at the back with the little sensor array on top. And there's a bit more of a side view, so you can see there, because I haven't used the blue tack, the Tesla cannon is basically pointing straight forward, but it's only marginal. And then if you really hate aircraft, you can go with the Reiter type, which obviously now has 3 flat guns on the tray and the other flat gun on top. So again, same hull, just changing out the weapons loadout. And then you have the tokens, so you get 2 of each of these types. So you can see there that you've got the bomber and the 3 fighters, so this is half of the tokens that you get. And then of course you have the big ticket item, the Tempelhof carrier. As you can see there, I've stuck down all 3 of the flat guns and done it exactly the same color scheme with your little sensor array at the back there. And in this configuration I've switched the flight lift token to show that I'm launching fighters at the moment. And it also has a pair of torpedo tubes facing forward. You can see they're looking like little eyes in the bow. And then in this little family shot you can see I've brought in some of the stuff from the sample sprue that I was sent a few months ago that you saw in the first video about the Germans, and you can see the little train, the gun battery and rocket battery elements, the massive railgun element, and that other cruiser hull, and the little escort hull. So hopefully you can see from the top there that with the Blucher battle group, the escort hull is slightly different, slightly smaller to the one that you get with the new box set, which is more destroyer size. And then put all those together off of the flight stand, and you can see once again, same cruiser hull, one on each side leading the carrier, the 2 new escorts, the slightly longer pointier ones, and the escort from the Blucher, they're a little stubbier, 2 of the tokens, and then off to the left there you can see that all the little extra spare bits and pieces for cruiser hulls that you'll get off of the 2 different cruiser sprues, one from the Blucher and one from the Tempelhof set combined. So at the moment you've got the flak cruiser and the railgun cruiser elements configured there, and then off to the side you've got a train, a Tesla cannon, pair of gun turrets, pair of rocket batteries, and the whole setup to launch aircraft, turn yourself into a little aircraft carrier. So that concludes this week's look at the new range of Dystopian Wars from Warcradle. Once again, thank you very much for them sending me those box sets for me to show you. If you do get a box set and you think, oh, where's my paper instructions have gone? Well, they don't come with paper instructions. The paper instructions and indeed the rules, orders of battle, etc., can all be found online. They're digital downloads, which saves on paper and saves on postage weight, which is all good. And here's a teaser for what might come next, because also available and up for pre-order at the moment is this thing. Yes, this is a gigantic iceberg carrier. Yes, it is clearly based on HMS Habakkuk, and yes, for some reason the Germans or the Prussians have it. No, I don't know entirely why it was them, but that was the choice that Spartan made back in the day with their Kickstarter, and Warcradle have continued that through. That actually comes with a fairly big box set that has a lot more ships in it. That is with me at the moment and in the process of building and painting, so maybe in a few weeks' time we'll have a look at that. It's quite a big chunky bit of resin to paint. And the other thing that's coming up that they've also sent me is a little bit of island and terrain set. So I'll be looking at that as well, probably position them around this socking great thing and all its friends. And then something that hopefully will arrive sooner rather than later, but haven't got just yet, but is also up for pre-order, The Crown, aka Britannia, aka the British. Hopefully I'll be having a look at those at some point after I've sorted out the gigantic carrier. Who knows, maybe sooner, because if they arrive in the next week or two, it'll be a heck of a lot quicker to paint these than the entire fleet that comes with the giant ice carrier. But the British are coming. Oh no. So yeah, that's potentially what you might see later on for Dystopian Wars, but hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, obviously let me know in the comments below, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.